This is it, our last module, where we will conclude our examination of remedies under Article 2 when there has been a breach of a contract for the sale of goods. Up to this point, we have focused solely on the buyer's remedies when the seller is in breach. But in this week's module, we'll switch sides and examine the seller's remedies where the buyer breaches. The seller's remedies will be our final topic for this course. But before we get into the details, let's start with the big picture. How might the buyer breach a contract for the sale of goods? Remember, in a contract for the sale of goods, the buyer's basic obligations are set forth under Section 301 of Article 2. That basic obligation is to accept and pay the seller for the seller's conforming tender of goods. And pursuant to Section 607, once the buyer has accepted, the buyer is obligated to pay the seller for the goods in accordance with the party's contract. So think about it. How might a buyer breach this basic obligation? The answer might seem obvious. The most common scenario is the buyer will breach by failing to pay the seller when payment is due. As we just said, under Section 607, the default rule of Article 2 is that payment is due to the seller upon the buyer's acceptance of the seller's goods. But the contract may also require payment up front, before the seller tenders or before the buyer is able to inspect the goods, in which case the buyer could breach by failing to pay the seller before the seller ever tenders the goods. But that is only one way that a buyer might breach a contract for the sale of goods. There are other ways the buyer might breach. For example, the buyer might breach by repudiating in advance its obligations under the contract before the seller ever tenders or before payment is ever due. Or perhaps the buyer might breach by wrongfully rejecting the seller's conforming tender of goods. Stated differently, the buyer might make an effective rejection even though the buyer did not have the legal right to reject the seller's conforming tender of goods. And there's one final scenario to keep in mind. The buyer might breach because, even though she rightfully rejected the seller's tender because it was non-conforming, perhaps the seller had the right to cure its imperfect tender, and the buyer breached by wrongfully refusing to allow the seller to tender a cure. So there are a number of ways the buyer might breach a contract for the sale of goods, all stemming in some way from the buyer's failure to accept and pay the seller the contract price for the goods. Regardless of the type of breach, the remedies available to the seller rest upon the same fundamental principle that we said underlies all contract remedies. Hopefully you have that principle committed to memory by now. The fundamental principle of all contract remedies, codified in Section 305 of Article 1, is to protect the expectation interest of the non-breaching party, to put the non-breaching party in the position she expected to be had the contract been fully performed, had there been no breach. Stated differently, to give the non-breaching party the full benefit of the bargain, typically by awarding the non-breaching party, the seller in this scenario, damages in the amount necessary to compensate her for the loss that she suffered as a result of the breach. Where the buyer has breached, the nature of the seller's remedy will depend on a basic question: who has the goods at the time of the buyer's breach, the buyer or the seller? And that will serve as our roadmap for this week's module. In the next video, we will take up the question of the seller's remedies by examining first those remedies in the context where the buyer already has the seller's goods.